All right, let's get started. Thank you all for being here. This is our 2021 FOIAFest Boot Camp Showcase panel. And as some of you may know, FOIAFest Boot Camp partners early career journalists of color with seasoned journalists who are skilled at using public records. And we started that last year with the support from McCormick Foundation and Driehaus Foundation. Alejandra Cancino and I created this model, and I'm so grateful that Nader and Maya were able to continue this work this year. And so I wanted to start off by kind of telling you why I helped create this program. Back in my first job in newspapers, I was in my 20s and I worked at a daily newspaper in California. And I knew that I wanted to do investigative work. I usually sat behind a seasoned reporter so I could see everything that she was doing. And I wanted to learn from her. I wanted to learn how she was analyzing data. I wanted to know how she was filing public records requests. It just all seemed so interesting to me. I watched her and I begged her to help me, to teach me. I wanted to see what she was doing. I even went as far as asking her if I could just kind of watch her do her work, and maybe I could pick up something from what she was doing. But she was not interested. So, like a good investigative journalist, I found a way to make it work for myself. I applied to plenty of trainings outside of the newsroom because I was not getting the support that I needed in those newsrooms. So that's when I realized the potential within creating networks outside of your newsroom. And especially for journalists of color, I have found my support system in those journalists of color who have taught me how to do this work and have also taken a chance on me and also support me during the midst of really chaotic things that have happened in my life. So I'm really grateful for that support. And I wanted to create something similar for younger journalists. And so I think there's also like the petty side of me. I can be kind of petty, that wanted to eliminate that excuse that I kept hearing from every employer when it came to hiring journalists of color. Not enough experience. They don't know how to do this work. They can't do this work. So that's where this came about. And there are so many talented journalists of color in Chicago, and here are some of them. I'm so incredibly proud of each one of you for taking this opportunity and just really like running with it and creating really powerful stories. So let's get started. I want each one of you to introduce yourselves. Tell me a little bit about like where you work and how long you've been a journalist, and what made you want to apply for the boot camp. Why don't we start with Samantha, Rita, and then Kiran?
All right, cool. I'm Samantha Smylie. I use they, them pronouns. And I work at Chalk Beach, Chicago, where I cover state education. So I'm looking at data all the time, and I'm just trying to figure out what's happening at the State Board of education bills coming out of the General Assembly, whatever the governor's doing, and sometimes I bounce around the state's local school districts. And I was supposed to say, why did I apply to the boot camp, right? Okay. Basically, throughout the entire pandemic, I had been covering stories about students with disabilities because as soon as schools closed March 2020, my first thought was that, oh my God, students who are in temporary living situations and students who have disabilities will be the most impacted by schools closing. Having a school building provides them with a lot of necessary services, not just for them to be academically successful, but for them also to be like successful in their everyday lives. And I had just been talking to parents over the course of that time, and they just kept saying the same thing to me, like, I haven't had my IEP updated or my individualized education plan updated. I haven't had a chance to talk to my child's teachers, to basically talk about, like, you know, if my child is in their learning marks. And I was like, well, that's a big thing. Like, they're supposed to be doing that throughout this pandemic, because the U.S. Department of Education did not like rule out any special education law at the time. And I was just like, there has to be some data for this. And I just kept mentioning it to like my, editors. And I just think, like, because the pandemic has just been, just crazy news, and a lot has been happening in the education space, that it just kind of felt like it was hard to get them on board with it. And I just knew that I needed to prove to them that this story was super important to me and that I needed to get it done. And I felt so strongly like there's data there. There's something that we can really do. And I just was like, okay, well, the Headline Club is doing this FOIAFest Boot Camp thing. I'm just going to apply for that. And I wouldn't say my proposal wasn't like very structured. I kind of made it clear that I was still in that exploring phase, because I didn't know everything that I was looking for, but I just knew something was there. So I just had to have that proposal like done, and I was really shocked that I got it. So, and I'm really happy about that. I'm gonna stop talking now. I feel like I talked too much.
It was a good proposal. Why don't we go with Rita and then Kiran? And just remember, we're going to kind of hit each state of your project. So we'll get to how you made it happen.
So, hi, everyone. My name is Rita Ocegura, and I'm a criminal justice and immigration reporter at Injustice Watch. I've been at Injustice Watch for about a year now, and I decided to apply to the boot camp because I feel like many young journalists didn't know what I was doing, especially with public records. And it's kind of scary to approach a FOIA and know how to write it out and things like that. But more than just like writing it out, I really wanted to learn, where do I even ask for FOIAs? Like, who do I get this information from? And what do I do with it after I get it? And because sometimes you get a huge data set and you're like, okay, now what? And that was really helpful to have a mentor to be like, okay, I got this. Like, now what do I do? Like, this is a lot. And it's like, let's try and narrow it. Let's try and think of ideas, things like that. So the boot camp was really helpful in that way, to be able to not just find documents and know what to do with them, but to also figure out what to do with the story once you get them. And yeah.
Kira, do you want to go next?
Yeah, so I'm Kiran. My experience with journalism and with my project is a little different. So I work as a freelancer primarily. I also am a staff writer at Southside Weekly, but most of my work is as a freelancer. I pitch to publications and they can decide whether or not they're going to take my story on. And if people don't like my pitches, I won't get to be a reporter. It's entirely dependent on whether editors choose me. So there's a different level of like security and stability than someone who's a staff reporter. And I started writing for Southside Weekly, just like picking up some stories when I was in graduate school at the University of Chicago. And I wrote a couple stories, and I learned a lot and I really enjoyed the experience. And then when the pandemic started, I was living in Italy, but I moved back home to Iowa, and I had a lot more free time because I wasn't going into the office every day. And so that's when I really started doing like full-time freelance journalism, sort of on the side of my full-time job. And I realized that because it wasn't my full-time job or what I was depending on to get health insurance, I could take on bigger, longer, more investigative stories. And FOIA is a huge tool for that. So my story that I worked on as a part of the boot camp was something that I became interested in while I was working not in journalism at all. I had worked at the sheriff's office in Chicago. I'd worked at a public defender service in DC. I'd worked at the Illinois Justice Project. And I had heard a lot about how at the ends of police shifts, there were a lot of like bad arrests, or like arrests that didn't always lead to conviction or seemed to be on sort of like spurious grounds because officers were trying to earn overtime. They'd heard this a lot, like anecdotally, and I was really curious to see if there was any real data behind it and if this could be and looking at overtime spending and then arrest data and dispositions and things like that. So my reporting partner, who is my editor at Southside Weekly, and I applied for a grant from the Fund for Investigative Journalism. So when I was applying to the boot camp, I knew that I was going to be able to work on this project with some support because I had received this grant, but I really didn't even know where to start. I had never really filed a lot of FOIA requests. My first FOIA request I filed during the protest, the racial justice protest, trying to get some arrest information. And it was my first ever time submitting a FOIA request. And I asked another one of my editors at Southside Weekly, like if he could send me an old FOIA of his, and I just copied it and like changed the words a little bit. I had no clue what I was doing. So when I came to the boot camp, I really leaned on my mentor to tell me like who to FOIA, what to FOIA. And then when I got the data back, there were these huge spreadsheets, like with hundreds of thousands of data points, and I had no idea where to even start. So he was really, really helpful in telling me how to interview the data, basically, how to find things that would make stories and how to create a series basically from these like spreadsheets just filled with numbers, which is what we did. And we published a series of pieces in Southside Weekly, but I still feel like it's like something we can keep exploring. And I got a lot out of the boot camp, and I decided to apply because I've always been a freelancer. Like I've never set foot in a newsroom in my life. So I've had no opportunities for really formal training. And I've been so lucky. Plug for Southside Weekly. I'm always trying to plug it. So lucky to work for Southside Weekly, which is a teaching paper. So I've learned a lot while working for that paper, but there weren't like necessarily opportunities where I could like look over someone's shoulder and see what a more senior reporter was doing, because I've never even been to the newsroom. So it was a really great opportunity to get those skills in a structured way. And I want to say one other thing about FOIA, which is it's not just useful for journalists. I use FOIA a lot as a researcher and as a research assistant. And that's part of the reason that like these professors have hired me, is because I know how to use FOIA. So if you're not a journalist, if you're not trying to like publish pieces, it's still a really, really useful tool to have in your toolkit, and you can use it for so many things.
Let's quickly shout out your mentors, because let me tell you, trying to get this off the ground, it was literally just like, who do I know and who's going to step in and like do this work? And I remember trying to partner people up with folks who had like similar personalities or like were doing like work in the same area. So let's shout out, can you all share who your mentors were?
My mentor was Jason Grotto, and I believe a lot of his work also is sort of focused on criminal justice and these like big data investigations. So he was really helpful in like explaining to me how to use things like R and Stata and like dusting off these things that I haven't opened since grad school, and trying to make stories out of just numbers.
My mentor was Dan from WBZ.
My mentor was Angela Caputo, who worked at the Chicago Reporter and also focused on education.
Yeah, thank you all. Okay, so let's kind of walk through this, each one of your investigations. So let's really start thinking about, and Samantha, you started talking about how you came up with the story. So maybe let's start with Rita this time. So kind of twofold. How did you come across the story, and what was your FOIA strategy? Like, talk to us about what were some of the initial conversations that you had with your mentors that really helped you kind of frame the project and the FOIA strategy?
Yeah, so my story first started off, we were looking at the Aurora Police Department, and something that interested us was the protest that happened in the summer of 2020 and what the strategies that were used by the police department during the protest. And when we started digging into what happened that day and what came because of it, the city of Aurora decided to do an initiative to provide more transparency and accountability. And then the question was, how transparent and accountable are they really being? So they created this open data portal where you could see the complaints of officers in the Aurora Police Department, but they didn't include the officers' names in that data. so there was no way to see trends. There's no way to see, oh, this officer has gotten this many in this year or in that year. So then that's what I FOIA'd. I wanted the data set, and I wanted the full data set, and I wanted to be able to actually see those trends, do those pivot tables, and see what's actually going on in there. And then I got the data set, and it was a lot. And it's kind of hard to navigate exactly, like, who are we going to look at now? Like, who is the focus? Do we look at who has the most? Do we look at what complaints they're bringing in? Things like that. So then Dan was really helpful in trying to sort that out and say, like, yes, let's do research. Keep doing research. That's something he kept emphasizing. Like, do research, figure out like what is the right angle to take. And something that we've started at Injustice Watch is a lot of engagement work around our story. So we put out a call out. We're like, hey, we're investigating the Aurora Police Department. If you have a story, let us know. And we got some responses from it. And then there was a rally around one police officer in particular. So then I went to that rally, and then, we started with that officer because it was obvious from the interviews, from people reaching out to me, and from that rally that people were interested in this officer. And he's ultimately the officer that we had in the investigation. So that was kind of how the story came about. It started off with protests and then ended up something completely different. And some more things around the FOIA strategy besides the large database. I had to then hone in this one officer. And that's when things got a bit more confusing and complicated. It was really helpful to have a mentor through that. And so I had to FOIA all of his complaints, and I had to FOIA the investigative summary of those complaints. I didn't even know the term investigative summary before this. So I had to FOIA those things to not just find out how many complaints he's had throughout his whole career, but what those complaints really were about. Because some of them were categorized under large categories like conduct. And what does that even mean? So then we found out that a lot of those conduct labels were actually sexual misconduct. So then we were finding out trends that were happening, and this was a great investigation, but now we have an idea of where to find other things in that data as well. So now we can look into conduct. What are the other conduct from other officers? What does that mean? So that's kind of how we went about doing it. I think I'll leave it there.
Yes, that's perfect. We will get to roadblocks, so hold your roadblocks for a few more minutes. Mm-hmm. Samantha, do you want to go next?
Yeah, and the question was just about like, how did we start it out, right? Okay. So after the proposal, then me and Angela sat down to work on the FOIA. And special education is very specific. And you have to learn a lot of federal and state laws at the same time. And then when you're an education reporter, and something I learned during my time is that you have to know like what you can or can't get based on like quite a few different like laws. So one is called FERPA, which is basically supposed to protect like certain information in regards to children, to protect their identities. And so this whole time I had to like keep going back and making sure like I was asking for information that the state and the city could give me. So I think that's part of my story too. Let me back up. I FOIA'd the State Board of Education and Chicago Public Schools for information in regards to the IEP process. So I basically asked like, how many students were referred for an evaluation? How many of those students actually got an evaluation? How many of those students were eligible for an IEP? How many of those students' IEPs have been reevaluated and updated throughout? I asked for school year 2018, which is 2017, 2018, all the way to the present. And that was 2020, 2021 that I also asked for that information. And the reason why I also asked the state for it is because there is a monitor in the school district that is overlooking like what CPS is doing in regards to special education. So I was like, the district might block me, but the state should have some of this information. And I really just had to keep going to the sources that I already had built from some of my previous reporting and really asking them, like, like, I keep hearing this from parents. You've also heard this from parents. What should I ask for in a FOIA request? What information do you think I can even get? And yeah, my sources were really, really helpful, because the advocates that, I talked to, they've also been filing for this information as well and trying to push it. So I think that's kind of what I did. And I also went back to previous reporting from other reporters. So like Sarah Karp at WBEZ is like, the reason why I can do any reporting on special education is because of her previous work. So I went through her work. I went through the state's investigation into Chicago Public Schools special education department. I went through their annual reports and then their monthly reports too, to figure out like what database I need to ask for this information. So I found that database, and the name of it is basically CPS SSM, IEP SSM system. And then I just kept, trying to find people to talk to about like what all I should ask for. Like I even went to a special education teacher to ask for, what specific language I should use in the FOIA. And that's kind of how I built the FOIA. I hope that made sense.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think this is like a really important part that I want to explore in a little bit. Kiran, can you tell me about your process of kind of like narrowing down your FOIA request? Because CPD is notorious for, just denying most of their records requests. So what was your approach?
Yeah, so I mentioned a little earlier about like the process of coming to the story. So then once we decided that we wanted to do the story, one thing that we knew is that we would have to break it down into little chunks so it wouldn't be denied for being overly burdensome, which is something that CPD does a lot and that I've experienced a lot as someone who files a lot of FOIA requests to CPD. And one thing that actually helped in this process was if you file enough requests with a particular agency, you become sort of familiar with the FOIA officer, or like more so they become familiar with your name, and they know that like if you're good at following up on it, they actually have to fulfill it because you're going to appeal it, you're going to keep following up on it. And my co-reporter had like filed FOIA lawsuits and things like that. And so I think part of it was that they knew that they should take us seriously and that we weren't going to back down. But another thing that we did was that we requested data by year and sometimes by half year, because these data sets that we were getting were really big. We requested all of the overtime shifts basically by officer name. And so there were just like hundreds of thousands of like rows of information where they'd be like officer name, badge number, district, and then like the reason for the overtime, what time the overtime started, what time it ended, what like times 1.5 or whatever rate it was that they were being paid for the overtime and how much it cost. And similarly to what Samantha and Rita were mentioning, some of it was like really vague. Like the columns for what the overtime was for, some of it would be like shift extension or like crowd policing or something, but like which crowd were they policing? Or like they'd be like event, but you wouldn't know if it was like a protest or a festival or like Lollapalooza or something. And so a big part of interviewing the data, I keep mentioning this, but this is something that like my mentor really stresses, like interviewing the data was finding out what the data even meant, like what were these terms? And so that was when it really came in handy to sort of build a relationship with the FOIA officer, because we had received all this data, but we didn't even really know what it meant. And so we would go back to them and we would ask them like, okay, what does this term mean? Like, can we get some more specifics? We have this data, like, can you tell us how they arrived at this like multiplier, or like these officers like have a flag next to their name. What does that mean? Like, how is that data categorized? And going back to the CPD FOIA officer like several times was super helpful. And another thing we did, similar to what Samantha mentioned, was we looked at what else was already out there. And so there was a OIG report on abuse of overtime, the Office of the Inspector General, and they had laid a lot of the groundwork for us. They hadn't really gone into specifics and they weren't looking at data as much as we were. They had basically interviewed a lot of people, both within the department and who were monitoring the department, saying there's a lot of things that are happening, basically like the biometric system that's supposed to be preventing officers from clocking in and out like falsely is basically not doing anything. Like officers can still clock in and out for each other. There's no real system of like making sure that there isn't someone approving their own overtime, and that's something that would happen a lot. And it wasn't always the case that like the chain of command was being followed in order to approve overtime for different ranks of officers. And there were a lot of ways that like when we looked at the data, we saw we're like, oh yeah, like it's supposed to be this level of officer who's approving overtime, but actually it's these like really junior officers who are approving it. And what are the consequences of that? Is it all right that this is being delegated, or does it mean that like bad entries that haven't been verified properly are potentially costing the city and taxpayers like millions of dollars? And in interviewing the data, like I had this like one big story that I wanted to write at the end, but the ones that we ended up publishing were just sort of about things we found along the way. The ones that are linked in this chat, they're about like the thing I just mentioned, like who's actually approving overtime, or like how does overtime compare, how does actual overtime expenditure compare to what the police chief has been saying about it, and does it match up with the public statements? And along the way to our like big story, which we never really got to in the end, we did a lot of like smaller stories based on things we just saw by like running some R regressions, or like even doing a pivot table, like really, really simple things that were just as interesting, in fact, and had just as serious of implications for like police accountability and funding and use of taxpayer money as this like big idea we had at the end. And another thing we did was we worked a lot with advocacy organizations like Chicago Appleseed. They were really useful in also providing perspective into, like we didn't do a lot of interviewing of people. We were mostly doing really data-driven stuff. And so they were really useful in sharing like stories of what they heard, and lawyers and people involved in the criminal justice system who they had like been working with who could testify to the more personal side of things. So our story wasn't only like these numbers telling the story, it was also based on people.
Yeah, I actually want you to help us expand on that idea of interviewing your data, because I think when I learned that concept, I was like, I wasn't like a young reporter anymore. So I think it's like a concept that is really useful to know. So tell me, what is interviewing your data?
Sure. So a lot of it is just like scrolling through spreadsheets and doing basically descriptive statistics. So seeing if there's any like weird trends in the data that's unexpected, or if there's any outliers, or if there are things that, like, for example, the level of the officer who is approving the overtime, if there's something that seems to be contrary to a public statement. So it's not really like hard statistical work. Like we could do it mostly in Excel and like maybe a little bit of like Stata or something, or R. But it was basically seeing like if there were any clustering of different data points where we wouldn't expect, or like maybe where we did expect, and it would confirm something that we've like been thinking about but didn't know if it was verified or not. Or just seeing like, okay, are most of the officers who are getting really high overtime payments, are they of a particular seniority, or are they in a particular district, or is it all getting approved by like the same officer? These things that like, if you have a small data set, you can sort of even figure out just by glancing at it, but like very easily you can do it by just doing descriptive statistics. Not what you normally think of when you think of investigative journalism, where you're really tracking something down, or you're doing like a really complicated regression. Just like looking at the data, seeing what you can find that might be a rabbit hole that you want to follow down, and using that as a starting point for like what your stories could actually be. Because what we thought our stories were going to be going into this project and what we ended up writing about were really, really different because of this interviewing the data process. The things that we like thought would come out didn't really come out, and some of the things we had like never considered ended up being weird things in the data that we just wanted to like poke around and look into, and ended up becoming bigger stories.
So let's get to the roadblocks, right? So you have a FOIA strategy going, you've sent out your FOIAs, you've done your research, you're coming across the OIG reports and all the supporting research, but then they're not giving you the records. They're citing exemptions, they're telling you this too much. How did you and your mentor kind of talk through the process of finding a workaround to get your records? Why don't we start with Samantha, then Kiran, and then Rita.
Okay. So in the story of like how I did my investigation, so March 3rd is when I finally sent out all of my FOIAs to the state and to Chicago Public Schools. The state was like, yo, go to Chicago Public Schools. We have nothing to do with that. the monitor can only read the reports that you're looking for on a view only level. And I was like, that sounds like trash. Like that doesn't, I was just like, that doesn't make sense. So you have access to this database. You can only view it, but you don't do anything else. So how are you really holding the district accountable? So I really pushed them on that. And I even sent I sent all of what they sent me via email and stuff to the state's attorney general's public access bureau, or the PAC, just to see if like somebody else can work around it. The PAC was like, no, they're right. Go to Chicago public schools, focus on that data. And I was like, okay. Chicago didn't even say they were going to extend it, give me an extension for a while. I think it took until the end of March when they said like, oh, we just couldn't find these records, or it's just too hard for us to put together these records. Can you give us some more time? And then it took more weeks after that, and they would use like, well, it's the pandemic, it's COVID, we can only do so much, we're sorry. And it took so long for them to give me any like excuse for why they weren't giving me this information. And I was like, you know what? I think end of April, I was like, oh no, I got to send this stuff to the PAC as well, because at this point they're breaking the law. Like at this point they're breaking our FOIA laws in Illinois. And at the same time that I was sending stuff to the PAC, the state's attorney general office was hacked. And so they couldn't even use their official emails. I had to send like all my stuff to personal emails at this time. And so really the PAC was not that helpful. I think June, I really convinced my boss, like, I really want this information. I really want the story to be done. Like, I think we should just file a lawsuit. I think that's like the good thing about being in a newsroom is that like somebody can find the money for you to do a lawsuit sometimes. Not all the time, especially like I work for a smaller nonprofit. So it was just, we were really, really lucky to like have the money to file a lawsuit. And then once the lawsuit was filed, CPS had to give us something, I believe, within 30 days. So they gave me a data set. It was like very clean though, but they gave me a very small data set in almost at the end of July at like 5:30 on a Friday. And it was just before I was like, we should just publish the story. They're not going to give us this information. I don't know what's happening with the lawsuit. We could just come back to it, but we should just file this story. And thank God other people was like, no, we're going to hold out just a little bit longer, Samantha. I know you want this story done because you've been working on it since March, and as soon as I was like got that information, I was like, thank God I saved it. But it took a while to get that information. It took like going to the PAC, the Public Access Council, going to, having to file a lawsuit, and also just with doing all of this work, I had to save all of my emails. And I am not that organized as a person. This project has made me super organized, because I will keep the receipts, but I will not organize them. So I had to, make sure I had my original FOIA request, what everybody sent back to me, whether that be like the exemptions, whatever, I had to send that back, make sure that was dated right. Whatever the PAC sent me, I had to make sure that was right. And I had to give all of this, the first time was giving all of what I had to the PAC, and then the second time was giving all of what I had to the lawyer. Yeah, that was a lot of work. All that stuff. Yeah.
It's a humbling experience. Rita, do you want to go next?
Yeah. So obstacles. There was a few. A main one is the discrepancies between data sets. So I had the large data set that they had given us with all the complaints of officers from 2016 to 2020. And then I had requested a full list of complaints against one specific officer. And I was noticing that there was some missing from the large data set that weren't in his own complaint list. So then I had to go back to them like, hey, I know these are missing. I know they exist because I already have them. And they're like, oh, okay. And then they send me, and of course that makes you think, what else is missing? What else are they not giving me? So then they ended up giving me more, and then seemed like, see, this is what I thought was happening. So I think I was really lucky that I had 2 data sets that I could compare that, because if not, I wouldn't have known that they were missing some. And it still happens today. I still FOIA them, and I asked for like a complete list of arrest records, and they send me, I was like, oh, we didn't have these. And then I sent a different one. Oh, I sent specific dates at first for arrest records, and they're like, we don't have 5 of these. And I was like, okay. And then I sent a complete list of all the arrest records that person had gotten, and all of a sudden those appeared again. So if an advice I would say, if your instinct is saying like there's something missing, they are not giving me something, like ask for it again, go to the PAC, because usually your instinct is right. And just like Samantha, you had to bring a lawyer in for them to actually do something about it. So I think that was like an advice I kept getting. It's like, well, keep pushing, keep calling them. I called the FOIA officer so many times. I'm like, well, what about this? Why can't I get this? Why aren't you giving me this? And just like, I know I was like, at some point I was being annoying, but I'm like, it's your job. You gotta try and get those records. And I think it's just like overcoming that. I don't want to make them mad, I guess. And then they're gonna withhold more information from me, because they have to give you that information. Like, you can't make them mad. Even if they're mad, it doesn't matter. It's their job to give you that information. So I think that was something just like personally I had to overcome. Just like, don't worry about it. Just keep pushing and keep pushing in whatever avenue that you can. And yeah, I think I would say that was a large obstacle. Just kind of making sure they give you the right data.
Thank you. Kiran?
Yeah, before I talk about obstacles, I actually just wanted to echo something that Rita said, because I think like in this panel, we're all like young women of color, and something that I've really struggled with is like not wanting to alienate crucial sources for my stories. Like I report on the jail a lot, and I used to work for the sheriff's office, but at this point, like due to my reporting, my relationship with like the sheriff and his communication people has like extremely deteriorated, just because like they're not happy with what I'm publishing. And at first that really got to me, because I'm someone who like wants to please people and wants to maintain good relationships. And that's also important to being a reporter. Like, these are institutions that you're reporting on. You need to get their comment. You need to have access to their data. You need to like be on good terms with their FOIA officer and things like that. And at some point you have to draw that line between like printing things that'll avoid getting you in trouble and printing like the things that got you into investigative journalism, which is holding people accountable. And it's slightly different from what Rita was saying, but it's something that I really, really struggled with, like over the course of this investigation and other investigations, like receiving nasty emails from like the sheriff's office or something like that. It like, I cried over them for sure. But then you have to think about like, what's a priority, right? Like making friends with like cops or like reporting on police misconduct. And it's sometimes actually really hard to choose the latter, even though it's like why you got into it. But back to roadblocks for the story. I experienced a lot of the same things that both Samantha and Rita were talking about. We also had to file a lawsuit, but my reporting partner worked with a nonprofit, or a pro bono rather, like law firm to do that. We were working with Southside Weekly, which is entirely volunteer run. So it's not like we had a lot of money to file lawsuits either. And we were really lucky that there were these lawyers who were willing to help us pro bono. And I actually, because my reporting partner was working on this, I can't remember the exact timeline of events, but I think they actually, once we started filing the lawsuit, they just gave us the data. Like, we didn't actually have to wait for anything to happen in the legal system, because they were like, oh, we have this data, we should just give it to you. Like, you clearly care that we're withholding it and you're going to do something about it. So sometimes just applying a little bit of pressure is enough. And then another problem that we had was we just had all this, so 2 things. So one is that we had 2 different data sets that we needed to link up with each other. We had this overtime data that we had gotten through FOIA, and then we had arrest data that we had gotten through the city's portal. And getting those to match up with each other, figuring out what arrests happened during which shifts by which officers was really difficult. And so we realized that we needed to file some more FOIA requests to get more information in the data sets that we had originally requested, like badge numbers and beats and things like that that could help us match those up. Because they were these really big data sets, so we had to do it in a way that we couldn't just like match them up by hand. And then another thing was like these were really big data sets with a lot of different types of data. So even just narrowing down like what things we wanted to look at was a huge challenge. And then figuring out how to analyze the data in a way that we were answering the questions we actually wanted answered. So I know that's really big, so I'll explain what I mean by that. So one thing we wanted to look at was like whether arrest time in shift had an impact on the quality of the arrest or the frequency of arrests. And so we wanted to see whether like being closer to the end of a shift had this effect. But we didn't want to know like the time effect. So we didn't want to know like, oh, is there a spike in arrests around noon? We wanted to know like, is there a spike in arrests an hour before an officer's shift ends? So making sure that we weren't just like recklessly making conclusions from the data and that we were actually asking the right questions in terms of like, okay, is this spike that we see because it's like a time of day where like crime isn't being prosecuted in the same way in the middle of the night, or like, is it something that's relating actually to the overtime, which is what we're trying to study? And the way we were able to ask those questions and sort of think them through is we reached out to some academics. There were some researchers at, I believe it was the University of Texas, it was somewhere in Texas, that had done a similar academic study on overtime in Texas. And so we were able to ask them how they'd set up their regressions and what fixed effects they had used and how they requested different types of data to look at shift effects instead of time effects. And that was really, really useful. So one thing that is just like a recurring theme throughout the series was we really drew on like collaboration and connections with other people outside of just Southside Weekly, right? We were working with like the OIG, we were working with Chicago Appleseed, we were working with these academics in Texas. And that was what allowed us to cobble together all these different types of information and types of analysis that we needed to approach like a pretty big data set that could be telling us a lot of things we just didn't really know where to look.
So how did you all bulletproof some of the analysis? Because I think that's also really important to understand, like at the core of investigative work is really the fact-checking part of it, right? Like you want to make sure that it's bulletproof. So can you talk a little bit about that process? Kiran?
I can go first because my answer to this is really short. Southside Weekly employs fact checkers. And so this wasn't really something that like, I did my best to make sure that we were drawing like valid conclusions from the data. And like some of those things that we talked about when we were doing our analysis, we went to great lengths to make sure that like the things that we were finding were the things that we were actually saying, not just some similar effect that we were attributing to a different cause. And then beyond that point, like just making sure the data was correct and like the more minutia of things instead of like the big picture conclusions that we were drawing. The fact checkers at Southside Weekly are so good at their jobs. Like, I feel worried about it at any point because they were making sure they had our backs. They made sure our story was soundproof, and that's something that like I work as a freelancer, and most of my stories don't get fact checked like that. Like I really have to do the fact checking work myself. But for this series, because we were working with Southside Weekly, we were so lucky that like it was something that we had taken out of our hands a little bit, which was really, really great.
So we have about 7 minutes left, and I really want to get to this one last question. And if folks have any questions for the panelists, please type them in the chat and I will read them out loud. So if you think about what you know now from where you started, is there anything that you've learned that you want to share with people that you think is like particularly important for folks who are just kind of starting to do this work? Why don't we start with Rita, then Samantha, and then Kiran.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that again?
What advice would you give to someone who is just starting out, knowing where you were at the beginning of the fellowship? Obviously, you know how to do a lot of different things now, but what are some of the things that you would, or like, what advice would you give to your younger self when you started this process? Maybe that's a better one.
Yeah, I think one of the most difficult things once you get the data is figuring out the story, strategizing around the story and how to write the story And I'm really grateful for the newsroom I have at Injustice Watch. It really just sat me down and we're like, just write. Okay, stop over analyzing everything and stop looking at all the different threads, because there was just so many stories in the data set that I didn't know where to begin. And just sitting down and be like, look at what you have already and just start writing on that and see where you get there. And then if you're missing things, then you can continue to FOIA, continue to dig. But first, just start with what you have. Just don't think about, don't overthink it, I think, is the main advice I would give people. Once you get that data, don't overthink it, see what you have and start going with it, and then move on from there, and always ask for help. I think that's something very hard, I think, for, at least for me, for as a new journalist, to ask for help, because you want to prove that you know what you're doing. You want to show that you belong there. And it's okay. It's okay to ask for help, because then you're just going to become a better writer, a better journalist, a better investigative journalist because of it. So yeah, don't be afraid to ask for help, and just start writing. I know it's hard to just say, just start writing, but really just start writing.
Samantha, you want to go next?
Yeah, I think so. I'm going to say, like, all of this is like, what I'm going to say is all colored by my experiences, as like, I'm finally made it to my 3rd year in the field. March 2nd would be my 2nd year at Chalk Beat. And I've been working throughout this whole pandemic. So when schools closed, like, I was, at home. I really didn't have much time in the office to, work with older colleagues, pretty much. So it's been very difficult for me during this time to be a reporter. But I would say, trust your gut. I know that that's really hard for early career reporters, no matter your age. I'm 26 years old now, but I was 24 when I first started. And, just trust your gut. Trust your instinct no matter what. I think whether people intentionally do this or not, they do kind of make you feel like, as a younger reporter or early career reporter, that you don't know what you know. But I know that I was born and raised in Chicago, and I went to Chicago public schools, and I grew up in Inglewood and went to schools in Inglewood. I know how under-resourced these schools are. And, my schools have closed, because of some of the things that's been happening in Chicago public schools. And so I feel like that's an asset when I walk into a newsroom, and people should take that seriously. I think that in addition to that, like, everyone needs help, and you should always be learning on the job. I don't care how old you are or how long you've been in the field. You're supposed to learn something new. We're not experts in most of the stuff we do. Sometimes it's just like, oh, like, I heard this one thing, this sounds real interesting, I want to learn more about it. And sometimes you can, get some help in your newsroom if you work in one. But most times for me, I've always had to either study by myself or get help, from other organizations. So thank God for the Chicago Headline Club, to IRE, or to like some of the other like NABJ, who actually like create space for those of us who are younger or just in the field who need some more professional development. I do think some of that should come from your newsroom as well, some of that professional development, but I understand also, like, some newsrooms don't have enough resources themselves. A lot of stuff has been happening financially at newsrooms because of the pandemic. And yeah, I think just, trusting your instinct, asking for help, going to find that help, and being very like, no matter what, I'm gonna get this done. Like, it's really hard to always feel like to prep yourself up and go after something, but everybody knows how hard it is to be in this field. Just like, you work so hard to get here, just keep pushing yourself, even when it's hard, and it's been hard. So I hope that was good advice.
That was great. Thank you. Okay, so I don't want to go over. So it's like we end at 11:50. So Kiran, would you mind trying to like do something quicker? I'm sorry.
I'll do it so quickly. So my first piece of advice is that, especially as a freelancer, your community is much bigger than you think it is. Like I still now go to two of my editors from Southside Weekly, Sam Stecklow and Jim Daly, with every FOIA question I have. And like everyone who is not, I don't know if this is true, but like everyone who I've ever reached out to in the Chicago journalism community is willing to help, like myself included. So if you ever have a question, message me or like someone else you've just seen on Twitter, and you can get the help you need like 99% of the time. And the other thing I would say is like, don't doubt yourself. I mentioned earlier that like the first FOIA request I ever sent, like I had asked Sam to send me one of his old FOIA requests. I just changed the words, I sent it, and I wrote a story about it. It was the first time I'd ever sent a FOIA request. And that piece like won the Lisa Gore for Best Deadline Reporting All Media last year. And like, I never sent a FOIA request in my life. I've never worked in a newsroom. I don't know anything. And I was like writing my stories in my bedroom closet in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. I wasn't even in Chicago. So don't count yourself out of like any investigation you want to do or anything you think is too big. I like had no clue what I was doing, and it turned out fine. And I can do it. Anyone else can too.
That's such a perfect way to end this. Thank you so much to each one of you. I am incredibly proud of everything that you've done, and I'm hopeful that we can continue this work in the next few years so that we can provide a platform for young journalists of color. Thank you so much. Sorry if I didn't get to your questions, but all of us are on Twitter, so, reach out. DMs are open. Thank you all.